Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with a large damp square-headed brush. I began by applying some titanium white to the base of our horizon. Then I took some primary yellow, applied that on top of the titanium white, and began to blend the two together softly. From there, I took an orange, which I mixed out of primary red, primary yellow, and titanium white. I applied that around the yellow, and yet again I began to blend fairly smoothly. The goal here was to render an application fairly void of brush strokes, and that's generally best achieved with a soft touch of the brush. From there, I'm going to go back to my palette. I'm going to grab some additional orange and begin applying that to the water in the same area that it is in the sky, as we are working on a bit of a colorful reflection. I'm then doing the same thing with the yellow and blending it about. However, this time I'm working more so in horizontal strokes, so you get a little bit of a streaky aesthetic for moving water. Then I'm going back up to the top right-hand corner. I'm taking a purpley brown, which I mixed out of primary red, a little bit of primary blue, a little bit of burnt umber, and a tiny bit of our Mars black. Here you can see that I'm blending it about in the same way that I was, and to the top right you see a very much purple version. To the top left you see a version that has a little bit more of a burnt umber. So maybe you have a preference one way or the other, and I wanted to show you that there were multiple options and you could get different effects with a little bit more, a little bit less red in that as well. From there I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to map in the mountains in the background with a bit of a burnt umber mixed with our orange. Now, as we get closer to the distance, it's going to blend with the white that we initially applied, which is good because it makes those rocks look like they're being more consumed by the light and farther away. As we get closer to us, they get a little bit darker. Here I'm even applying a little bit of Mars black to the bottom and blending it up because that area is at the bottom of the mountains and it just won't be receiving as much light. The black and the white that are mixing with this really adds to give it a lot of depth, as now it has a bright, a middle, and a dark tone. Then I'm going to use that same brush. I'm going to grab some pure Mars black and I'm going to begin working on our tree line in the distance. I'm going to do so with a litany of vertical strokes, as you can see here, and I'm just trying to create varying clusters of trees. I want them to be different sizes. I want them to all be unique and interesting. The worst thing you could do here is make them all look the same. So try to leave slight openings in these areas. Try to make some larger, incorporate dips in varying places as well. And the accumulation of all of these different little techniques will render something that's much more interesting. They don't have to have a lot of detail because they are still fairly in the distance, and so we're only really rendering an implication of them. If we were to incorporate a lot of additional detail to them, then it might look a little bit awkward, as we wouldn't perceive it from this far away. It's important that you save your details for your foreground, otherwise the painting can kind of look a little bit messy and lose its depth of field. Now here I'm incorporating a little bit of additional purple down into the bottom left-hand corner, and I'm blending it out. Then I'm grabbing some Mars black and doing the same. The goal here is to render a good reflection of everything we just did, but also incorporate some horizontal lines to show that the reflection is being disrupted by the current moving water. So you want an amalgamation of the two things, the water and the reflection of here, the tree line. In other areas might be the rock or the sunset itself. Here I'm interjecting a little bit of additional orange back in there, and I'm doing a lot of these horizontal lines as well, as they're just going to add a little bit of additional detail, and we're just spreading the colors about to make it a little bit more cohesive. So now I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm going to begin drawing in my boat. You could see this at the start of the painting, and I can actually still see it because I drew it with a fine-tipped Sharpie marker. And that you can generally see it through the first couple of layers of paint, so you don't have to go back and redraw things. However, you need to be careful of where you use it, because if you use it in an area where you're going to use a very thin amount of paint, you'll still see through it and it can look kind of messy. So just use it for the areas that you feel will really receive a good amount of paint. Generally, that's the foreground. Now I'm going back and I'm adding some additional light to the reflection area where the sun is. We're using some primary yellow, we're using some titanium white, and we're applying it all in the same way we were before with horizontal strokes. Little portions are blending with the Mars black, which is rendering a bit of a green, which is actually really nice and welcome considering we're working around a reflection of a good amount of trees. And again, the addition of the extra color is just going to diversify our painting even more and make it a little bit more eclectic. From there, I'm switching over to my medium-sized round-headed brush. I'm grabbing the same purple that we used in the top right-hand corner, and I'm beginning to work in some clouds, as you can see here. When you're rendering clouds, you generally want to work with a round-headed brush, as it innately has a round edge. And that means it will render something that's a little bit more soft, a little bit more feathered. You want to save your square-headed brushes for subjects that innately have sharp edges. So it's a little tip, but it can really go a long way. Here I'm also allowing some of my clouds to be much more transparent than others, and that's just going to add a little bit of diversity. It'll show that light passing through different clouds in a different way, and it'll make it a lot more interesting. You also want different sizes of clouds. Here I'm going to combine a bunch of them with the medium-sized square-headed brush. And I mentioned that we want to do a lot of our clouds with the round-headed brush. However, this is an option. It isn't normally ideal, but when you want to get a lot of paint on the canvas, the round-headed brushes generally can't hold that much, so we switch over to this one to get all of that there. As I run out of paint, I go more towards the horizon and the bottom area because it'll blend much more so with our initial application and we'll get something much more clear and transparent. I kind of want my larger, more daunting clouds in the foreground, and as we get farther away, closer to the sunset, they get smaller and smaller, they get more transparent, and that really helps interject some depth into the piece as well. So from there, I'm going to go back and I'm going to rework on our little boat. I'm doing this because the initial layer of black kind of blended with the still wet water, and we weren't able to get the stark effect that we really wanted. So I needed to let that dry, but now that it is, I can go back and kind of remedy it. I'm using the smaller square-headed brush because it is the best brush for this type of detail. It can hold a good amount of paint, and it renders really sharp line work as well. Here you can see that I'm having to do a couple of applications because acrylic paints are innately semi-transparent, and this is something that we need to be fairly thick. So I just applied that there. It could honestly use another application, but until then, I'm going to go back and I'm going to add some additional highlights in the water. We're continuously taking breaks and then going back to the water and the reflections and all of that because we don't want to get something too muddy. We don't want all of these pigments to just continuously blend into each other. We want to let it dry so that we can add a new pigment on top that isn't diluted by the pigments that are already on the canvas. So sometimes if you're getting a really messy color, you're not getting exactly what you want, let that area dry and then come back to it with the color that you really want, and you should get a much more natural application and rendering of the color you'd actually like. Here I'm going in and I'm just continuing to work on the clouds, trying to make them a little bit more interesting and always evolving, as you can see. Again, I'm trying to get a really good mixture of ones that are very transparent, closer to the horizon, and ones that are much more full and opaque, closer to us, the viewer. I'm also working a little bit of that purple back down here into the water, just to ensure that the whole painting is cohesive and the reflections are working out fairly well. Speaking of reflections, here you can see that I'm working some back into the water. Because we did so many horizontal strokes, I kind of felt like we lost the reflection of a lot of the trees. So I'm just working those back in here fairly quickly with the medium-sized square-headed brush. and it's just a process of going back and forth. But I really hope you enjoyed this 10-minute painting. I really had a lot of fun. I think it's a fantastic summer piece. If you'd like to learn more about acrylic painting, about blending, mixing, how colors work, all of that, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long lessons like this where I show you my color palettes, how I'm mixing everything, there's also a link to hour-long lessons in the description over on my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.